Lucy Connolly, the Northampton childminder who was jailed for a tweet, has lost her appeal. She was jailed for 2.5 years for what I think everyone can agree is a pretty disgusting tweet. Tom, I don't think anyone's surprised that she lost her appeal, given how seriously our authorities seem to take speech crimes. But what have you made of that?
No, I mean, when the ruling came down, which was delayed from last week, that's a strange way in which it was expected at the end of last week, and it then comes out at a later date as a kind of written statement, I think probably to try and sort of dampen down any of the kind of media interest or to try and slip it out, but that hasn't really been successful because a lot of people have taken a keen notice of this case. As you say, he was given 31 months in prison for inciting racial hatred. As you say, obviously a despicable tweet, but I think that many people across the country are wondering, 2 years and 7 months in prison for a despicable, bigoted tweet that was deleted a few hours later, at the very least, is disproportionate, let alone the kind of deeper problems around incitement, freedom of speech, and where you draw that line. The appeal itself wasn't about the conviction, it was about the length of the sentence. It hinges on the fact that she was, like many of the kind of Southport speech criminals, pled guilty, seemingly under quite bad advice, essentially. And the appeal was very much on whether or not she intended to incite violence. She says she didn't. Obviously, the court's has upheld the original conviction. But I think you can demonstrate how wonky and warped our priorities are when you compare what she was given to what actually an actual Southport writer was given. There was a gentleman called Philip Prescott who was part of that mob that menaced that mosque. He got 28 months in prison.
Yeah.
So this is a very clear-cut case in which we found ourselves in a situation where the British state takes despicable words more seriously than despicable actions. And why more people aren't concerned by this, I don't really know. I mean, if anything, there's been a quite unsavoury thing on social media in recent days of people just flabbergasted that anyone would be concerned about this particular case.
Yeah.
And it must just be because they support the sentiment that was expressed there. And clearly that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about defending Lucy Connolly herself or what she said. It's about looking at the rights involved here, the severe punishment that's been meted out, and whether or not this is even sane in a society that should care about freedom and so on, and shouldn't be so blasé about sending people to prison for very long periods of time, when it's quite clear that in this despicable statement, taken as read, this is not someone who's a danger to the public in a meaningful sense. So yeah, the ruling was expected. I think that's fair to say, but debate about it certainly hasn't gone on much.
Yeah, Claire, I mean, jail time for a tweet is quite shocking in a short sentence, let alone the amount of time she's been given.
It's absolutely disproportionate on any basis. It was interesting because I just was involved in a discussion where somebody said about Jimmy Lai, from Hong Kong. They said, can you imagine being locked up in prison for expressing your opinion? And I thought, yes, Lucy Connolly as an aside, but you know what I mean? Like everybody kind of can say that about somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of complete self-congratulatory. We're not authoritarian. And I think we've all got to be very careful about this because we're also in a situation whereas quite a lot of us have rather kind of smirked at the rather unsavoury way that Gary Lineker has had to kind of leave the BBC with his tail between his legs sort of thing, having retweeted an anti-Semitic tweet or post. Then we find out that the police are going to visit him and people are saying, yes, about time, serves them right, give them a taste of what other people are. And you think, no, tit for tat jailing of what you posted or said is not the way to go. And there's obviously other examples in the news as we speak. I think with Lucy Connolly, I think the thing that's really shocking about it is that they, which Alison Pearson's drawn a lot of attention to this, is that they have been so vindictive about it. I mean, she's obviously not a threat to society. So she's being punished, fair enough. That's what jail is for. But this is happening alongside a number of other situations. Early release. They're emptying the prisons out left, right and centre. Well, they won't even let her go home. They won't even put her on a tag or, it's kind of like unduly unpleasant.
Which she would normally, someone in her circumstances would almost certainly be entitled to under normal circumstances.
Yes, because you've got no criminal record, no indication that anything, no indication as it happens that she was going to do anything then at all. I think that it feels a bit like what it was like during the riots, when it was very much watch what you say. It became a very politicized show trial type atmosphere. And I think that in some ways she represents that. No, we're going to hold you up as a threat to anyone who says the wrong thing. If you say the wrong thing, it gets us into some very dangerous territory, because your point about incitement, Tom, I think incitement has now become a really weaponized word, and nobody knows whether she is being done for, when I say nobody knows, is it incitement for violence or incitement for hatred? First of all, there's a distinction. Hatred is entirely subjective anyway. Incitement for violence is very narrowly drawn in the law. I mean, you literally, and by the way, that's right. I mean, if somebody says, I've got the gun, meet you on the corner, here's the address, that's different. But the incitement that she's being accused of is very vague. And you suddenly realize that incitement is just people expressing a strong opinion that somebody really might agree with. And so it's kind of implying, I mean, first of all, you might read it and not do anything. Generally, that's what happens. But even if you agreed with something and decided to do it, I mean, you have to take responsibility for that. You don't have to do what you've seen somebody post on Facebook. And she wasn't advocating action. She was actually describing that, well, if that happens, I don't care. And she deleted it, as we know. And then the final thing is, we've just had a situation where pre-sentencing reports have caused some controversy, because we discovered that the sentencing council, unelective Quango that it is, had put out very strong advice saying that if you have were a member of an ethnic minority or a particular community, you should have a pre-sentencing report, which would mean that you wouldn't go to prison if you were guilty.
Or reduce the likelihood of you...
Reduce the likelihood, but I can tell you, hardly anyone on pre-sentencing reports gets... It's a massive reduction of the likelihood of you going to prison. And that is a common factor. There's I'm not arguing that you shouldn't have pre-sentencing reports, but this was obviously rightly condemned, even by the Labour Party's Justice Minister, Shabana Mahmood, who said this is two-tier, justice based on sentencing, based on people's ethnicity and skin colour. We can't have that, right? That's not equal before the law. But it is fair enough that judges can say, well, what am I going to do? They've got 5 kids at home, and what I mean? And it's not that strong. Anyway, all I'm saying is, everywhere you look, there are examples of mechanisms used by criminal justice to have a proportionate response in relation to sentencing. The new sentencing review that's just been released by David Gork, Conservative, I mean, it shows you what the kind of people who are in the Conservative Party, but anyway, has come out for the Labour Party, is incredibly liberal, if you want, about saying people should be let out of prison for this, so people should never be put in prison, there should be more community sentences. That might well be an argument. I think the fact that that's just come out at the same time as Lucy Connolly's had her appeal refused just makes it even starker that she's actually being punished politically. It's not to do with what she said. And that's, I think, something that we should be all up in arms about.
And I think, I'm sorry, Fraser, I know you want to move on to Biden, but the incitement question, I think, is really important that we wrap our heads around that as well. Because of how bad the censorship has gotten in this country, because of the fact that you can be visited by the police for saying far milder things than what Lucy Connolly said. I think we've had almost the luxury of having this debate on easy mode. Like, most of the time you'd be sticking up for the rights of someone to say something actually pretty sensible, like there are 2 sexes, or whatever might be the case. But it's about these hard cases where you really make clear where the lines are. Incitement to violence is a crime in every civilized country. Even in America, in the First Amendment, you cannot incite violence. That's the point in which speech reaches basically into the kind of commission of criminal action. Yeah, and I think their standard, which is one I would be very keen for us to adopt, is that it has to be speech which is both likely and intended to cause imminent lawless action. So very much, in the Southport situation, someone who's standing, in front of a mob saying go, or, telegramming locations and Molotov cocktail recipes to a willing audience, that's fundamentally different to what we're talking about here. And it's one of those things where it's important that we make the case for why incitement to violence has to be something very distinct why incitement to hatred, which in British law is kind of seen as a very close cousin of incitement to violence, but nevertheless gets you into far more nebulous territory.
Yeah.
Because you're effectively inviting the state to define what is and isn't hateful and whether or not it should be punished. It becomes inherently political in that sense. You know, even if the politics you're talking about is despicable, it still breaches you into that territory. So I think it's important that we do have out these hard arguments. We do even stick up for the rights of, not for the individual, but for the rights of people to be able to speak, because freedom of speech rests on those hard cases as much as it does on some of the more straightforward ones, I suppose, that we're talking about in recent years.
If I could just, because I think it's so important, this, because I'm not saying I'm necessarily, able to articulate all the nuances of it, because there are things, there are ways that you get trapped a little bit. So just to use an example, when Hope Not Hate supporters, put it about that there was going to be, the gathering of far-right racists who are going to go around beating up Muslims, and they were going to be all in cities all around the UK. That, in a way, did lead to then gangs of Muslim youth getting together to defend their local communities. Now, as it goes, by the way, this was complete misinformation. It really was like a made up story. And then they said, oh, well, it doesn't matter because we had really good. The next day they said, but at least it brought all the anti-racists out on the street. Yeah. And in some ways, I did feel like that was a bit like incitement. It was based on misinformation. It brought me right. I understood it, by the way, because if you did think that there was going to be people wandering around throwing acid in your face because you were Asian, then, people are going to want to defend themselves. So there is this sort of like difficulty, but I also noticed, I've noticed in relation to this absolute tragedy in Washington of this young Jewish couple who've just been gunned down outside a community centre, and the person who gunned them down, basically, this is for Palestine, free Palestine, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that people have said is, that's what you get if you popularise a slogan, globalise the Intifada. And when you hear it, you've got to know it will lead to these consequences. And in a way, I understood that, which is if you soften up the territory around how bad things are, then actually people, this is what it looks like. Then I suddenly thought, oh no, don't go down that route, because I could just see that would suddenly, they'd be banning that slogan on the basis that anyone who used it is about to go and gun someone down. And of course, we just have to, so it's hard cases. You have to really think it through. And the more that we free speechers can set ourselves the challenge of those hard cases, I think the better we will be doing greater service to those people who are struggling, because they want to be free speech, but they're really glad to see some of these people getting punished, because they are the people who would silence us at the drop of a hat. But we can't let them get away with that.